Mark Schneider was born and raised on Long Island to a French mother and an American father. Mark has worked for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for the last 28 years, where he has portrayed General Lafayette all over the world. Today, Mark is setting his talk on August 18, 1825, where General Lafayette was completing his 13-month, 6,000-mile, 24-state visit of the United States, courtesy of President James Monroe. And here's the way it's going to work. First 30 minutes, he's going to be in costume as General Lafayette. The next, he will leave, walk there, do his stage exit, and come back for 15 minutes as Mark Schneider. And then there'll be Q&A, and you can ask him about anything you want to ask him about. So without further ado, please welcome to our stage General the Marquis de Lafayette.
And that, of course, is Marie, Joseph le Marquis de Lafayette. What a pleasure and honor it is to see all of you here on this simply magnificent day. How it is hard to believe it is already the 18th day of August of this year, 1825. But nonetheless, a day of celebration, is it not? Yes. How I will always love you, Americans. For in reality, you have no idea what I am celebrating, yet you're willing to celebrate right along with me. You know, I think that's incredible to the American people, how very optimistic you are, or simply in want of a party. How could you know, my dear friend?
For I, General Lafayette, have only recently returned back to America after 40 long years. Yes, my friends, the last time I set foot upon American soil was just after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which of course occurred in September of 1783, ending the Great War for American freedom. So thus, in 1784, I returned for 6 months to celebrate with all of you, my beloved brothers and sisters here in America. But even though 40 years have passed, we must never forget how that independence was in fact achieved. For all of those brave soldiers, sailors, and Marines alike who have fought and bled upon countless battlefields to achieve American freedom, let us applaud them all. Well, no doubt, if you have picked up a gazette, you realize that I have been invited back to America, courtesy of your very own former president, Mr. James Monroe, to be what he is calling a guest of the nation, to tour all 24 United States. Madam, can you imagine? 24. Do you realize the last time I was here, you had but 13? Oh, goodness, at this rate, you'll have as many as 50 one day. Could you imagine, madam? Well, as so many adventures begin, mine began in New York City on the 16th day of August of 1824, in front of 90,000 of its inhabitants. What a welcome. I traveled northwards to the upper part of that state, transferring over to Connecticut, onwards to Rhode Island, Providence to be sure, into Massachusetts Bay, Boston, of course, even a slight detour to a place called Quincy, where I met with your second president, Monsieur John Adams. You know, it was he and Monsieur Jefferson who once said of me that I had a canine appetite for popularity. Still not quite sure what to make of that, but it was a pleasant visit regardless. I then traveled southwards, went to the noble city of Philadelphia. I went to that place where you declared for independence. In fact, I referred to it as Independence Hall, and I hope that name will stick. Onwards to Baltimore, and then, of course, to the federal city of Washington, where I met and I thanked my dear friend, President Monroe. But friends, now that I have returned, now that I am in the twilight of this visit of 6,000 miles in 13 months, 24 states, many of them more than once, I am reminded of what first brought me here to America in the first place. I recall first hearing of this great cause back in 1775. Back then I was but a sous-lieutenant, a second lieutenant, newly promoted to the rank of captain. In truth, only because my father-in-law owned the regiment. So it was actually a wedding gift. Well, there I had found myself billeted in the eastern part of France in a city called Metz. And as was commonplace back then, we would often have these grandiose dinner parties with all of the most noble officers and attendants. And there we would typically speak of the various subjects of the day. Perhaps a war that had begun, a war that had concluded, a new treaty that had been signed, perhaps a new innovation in strategy or in tactics. But on one occasion we had a very special guest, and this guest was none other than the Duke of Gloucester, the brother to George III. Now, the Duke of Gloucester, unlike his brother, the King of England, was rather sympathetic to the American cause. In fact, many were of the opinion that he thought America should be free and independent. So, we all listened in on what he had to say. Now, of those great officers present there that evening, there was the famous Comte de Broglie. Many of you probably remember that name quite well from his exploits during the 7 Years' War. And there were some who even said that he was going to be given command of the Continental Army in the place of General Washington. Now, the Comte de Broglie was a fine officer, to be sure, but I think we are all thankful that General Washington remained in command. Are we not? Goes without saying. There was, of course, my beloved friend, le Baron de Kalb, the one man perhaps most responsible for bringing me here to America. I can still recall receiving the dispatch of the news of his death after the Battle of Camden in August of 1780. Most distressful to me, but even more so to the great cause of American freedom, for he was such a fine officer. There was, of course, the Chevalier de Buisson. Madame, the Chevalier de Buisson, I thought I recognized you. Madame, you danced a minuet with the Chevalier. It was at the last of the Queen's birthday parties, was it not? Madame, you are being quite modest. You realize you are still the talk at Versailles. Oh, dear friends, she danced the most magnificent minuet I have ever seen dance before. Do you recall the name? Oh, how could you forget? It was called Le Dauphin. Perfectly stepped, not one error. Madame, you must have worked with your dance master for weeks, if not months. Oh, and upon conclusion of this perfect minuet, what did the Queen say to you? C'est magnifique, it is magnificent, and you know very well the Queen never gave compliments to anyone but herself. You know, Madame, if only I could find a few musicians here this afternoon, we could all see an example of that minuet. Would you like that, my friends? Oh, alas, who are we kidding, Madame? We'll never find a musician awake before 6 p.m. Another time. Oh, forgive me, I have veered off the course of my story. Let me return. So, that evening, we spoke of many subjects. We spoke of the fighting at Lexington and at Concord, of the Grand Congress in Philadelphia, and of course of the great man himself, that of General Washington. So it was by the conclusion of this meal that I told my brother officers that I was ready and willing to fight, and if need be, die for this cause. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Why, Monsieur le Marquis? Why would you want to go and perhaps die in another man's war? For France and England were not at war at that moment. Why would you want to risk yourself in such an endeavor? Well, I believe you know the answer to that question. For this had been a war like none other in the history of man, had it not? This was a war of great ideas, of the freedom, even the liberation of mankind, a war that had embraced the ideas of the great thinkers of what we often refer to as this enlightened age, some calling it an age of reason, with men like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Locke. And what are they speaking of? Representation in government of an equality of mankind, that a man, no matter what class in society he might be born, whether he be black or white, Catholic or Protestant, rich or poor, enslaved or free, should not make a difference, but simply by the way in which that person might carry themselves and prove themselves in this world. My dear friends, after these more than 40 long years, are you still in agreement with these great ideas? Well, I am pleased to hear it, for as am I, and as I shall continue to be until my dying day. So thus, that evening, I rose up from my chair, I drew my sword, I came towards my host, the Comte de Broglie, and told him I was ready to put my colors to this great and noble cause. But alas, you know what he said to me, monsieur? Sit down, Monsieur le Marquis. I believe you've had a bit too much wine this evening. But friends, it was not the wine. It was simply my enthusiasm for this great and noble cause. So what could I do? Well, I thought about it for some days, and then I said, I shall simply go to Versailles. I shall present myself at court in front of the King and Queen of France, that of Louis XVI, Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, and ask them if I might have permission. So off I go to Versailles, presenting myself at court, asking the King and Queen if I can take part in this noble adventure. And what do they say to me? Give it a try, my friend. You've got a 50-50 chance. You've heard my tale before. One thing you must know about me, the Marquis de Lafayette, is that everyone, and I mean everyone, says no to me at least once. So the king responds with, oh, je regrette, monsieur le marquis, ce n'est pas possible. C'est un moment bizarre quand la France et l'Angleterre ne sont pas en guerre et je ne souhaite pas que vous en commenciez une. I'm sorry, monsieur le marquis, it is just not possible. It is a rare time in French history where France and England are not at war. And I do not wish for you to start yet another war with that horrible nation of merchants, as we French used to refer to the English. Well, that really should have been the end of it. For when the King and Queen of France say you cannot do something, you cannot. But I did the unthinkable. I disobeyed them. I left my regiment. I went to the western part of France, and there at the port city of Bordeaux, I purchased a ship fittingly called La Victoire, the Victory, for that is what I was in search of, victory in this great and noble endeavor. Well, of course, the King and Queen of France soon found out that I, the Marquis de Lafayette, had disobeyed them, and well, do you think they were pleased with this? Au contraire, quite displeased. In fact, so much so, they sent out soldiers to try and apprehend me. And if I was to be apprehended, of course I was to return back to my regiment at Metz, or worse, to my father-in-law at Marseille. So I had to act with the utmost secrecy, preparing all that I would need, a crew to man my ship, companions to join me, all of the supplies that I would need, for in truth, I did not know when or if I would even return back to France. Well, when all was prepared, the harbor master at Bordeaux inquired, what is your destination, monsieur? Where are you headed? You see, he did not realize I was, in fact, the Marquis de Lafayette, for I had disguised myself. Now, madame, if you had to wear a disguise, a costume, and you wanted no one to know it was you, what would that costume be? There you go. Look at that, madame. You were thinking about maybe escaping something in life. I jest with you, of course. Well, I have a funny story to tell you, madame. The English newspapers reported that I, the Marquis de Lafayette, disguised myself in a woman's gown. Can you imagine? Well, don't imagine that. Don't believe everything you read or hear, especially if it is written by an Englishman about a Frenchman. No, there was no woman's gown, madame. Instead, I simply disguised myself as a merchant there to take part in a bit of commerce with the people of Spain. So not having any issue with this, they of course allowed me to pass. And true to my word, I did go from France to Spain. But what would be my ultimate destination? America, exactement. Now, this journey took me 8 long weeks. Have any of you been to sea for 8 weeks? I thank you for your service. Yes, I'm glad that I joined the French army and not the French Navy, because I was seasick nearly every day of my journey. But after 8 long weeks, as I looked over the bow of my ship, I could see the Americas for the first time. And we had landed at a place called Georgetown in South Carolina. How I recall that evening perfectly well, for even though it was evening, the moon was so bright that it illuminated everything that we looked upon. So as I put my foot upon American soil for the first time and met you, the good people of the United States, well, what do you think my first impressions were of you, the people of the United States of America? Perfect. It's better not to answer that question. It was not a very good one, because the first Americans I met here in America tried to kill me. Not a good start. So we had landed at the plantation of a Monsieur Auger, a Benjamin Huger, or Auger is the way he pronounced it, an ardent patriot, but he had mistaken me and my companions for Englishmen. Can you imagine, madame, mistaking me for an Englishman? Do you know, in hindsight, I don't think the moon really was that bright. Well, I quickly assured them that we were not. We were there to help them in their great and glorious cause, and once they realized this, they welcomed us with open arms. But we were not there upon a holiday. We needed to make our way to Philadelphia as quickly as possible. So, after bidding farewell, after thanking them for their kindness, their hospitality, and most assuredly for not killing us, we began that long journey northwards. It took us several weeks, but eventually we would arrive in Philadelphia City, the largest city in former English North America, and its 40,000 souls. Now, my friends, before I had departed France, I had met with an American agent in Paris. He was from Connecticut, his name Silas Dean. and he was giving out what he called promissory notes. And as the name implies, it promised something. In my case, it promised that if I, the Marquis de Lafayette, were to come to America, I would be granted the rank of Major General in the American Army. So there I was, promissory note in hand, and I approached Congress. I said to them, honor me so by granting me a command in the Continental Army that I too might fight against tyranny. And now what does Congress say to me? You're doing great, my friend, well done. They say, thank you for coming, Monsieur le Marquis. We appreciate you offering your services, but we don't need, nor do we even want your help. Now, can you imagine this? What I had endured up to that moment? I had left my regiment. I had disobeyed the King and Queen of France. I had traveled 8 long weeks at sea, seasick nearly every day. I had nearly been killed by the first Americans I met here in America. I had traveled from South Carolina all the way to Philadelphia in the month of July, just to be told by your members of Congress to return back to France. Well, I ask all of you, what would you have done? Would you have returned back to France? Of course not. You would persevere. You would overcome. You would triumph in the end, just as I had done. Well, I made a second attempt, saying, very well, you will not give me a command of soldiers, but perhaps you will allow me to serve as an aide-de-camp to General Washington, as an assistant to the great man. And yet again they say to me, I'm sorry, Monsieur le Marquis, but once again this is just not possible. Besides, we don't have enough money to pay you. Well, dear friends, I finally said boldly to your members of Congress, then I shall serve at my own expense. And would you know it, with those immortal words, your Congress immediately made me a Major General. I could not imagine my good fortune, for as I have shared with you already, I was but a captain in the French army, and a newly promoted one at that. But here in America, I was made a Major General, a General of Division. I could command upwards of 5,000 soldiers, yet in truth, I never commanded more than 50 in my entire life, and all at the age of 19. Well, good fortune would follow me again. For that very next evening, the people of Philadelphia were holding a ball for General Washington, a party. You know all about parties, don't you, madame? But this one held in honor of General Washington for defending the city of brotherly love. And how I recall when he walked into the room. For I knew precisely who he was before he spoke, even though we had never met before. It was simply by the way in which he carried himself. For to me, he was truly an aristocrat without the name, a nobleman without the title. He came forth, he held out his hand, he said to me, I thank you, Monsieur le Marquis, for coming to support this cause. Think of this new place as your new home. Think of the officers around you as your new family. And think of me as your new friend. And with this, I could not help myself. I immediately embraced him. I think I might have embarrassed him a bit with my French custom. But I said to him, from now on, mon général, j'ai deux patries, la France et les États-Unis d'Amérique. From now on, I shall have 2 countries, France and the United States of America, and thus my great adventure had begun. But it was not to be all merriment, all minuets, all frivolity. There was a war to be fought, and I would have my taste of it at a place called Brandywine in Pennsylvania. Now, I had no soldiers under my direct command, but in the midst of that action, General Washington turned to me and said, General Lafayette, General Sullivan's division is beginning to crumble and weaken. I want you to ride up to those men and regroup them and push them back online. I immediately rode into action. I did my best to encourage them, but they ran right by me. I wheeled my horse around, and at that precise moment, a musket ball found my leg. My boot began to fill with blood, overflow with blood. In truth, I thought I was going to be killed in my first engagement. But I kept my courage. I kept my strength long enough to rally those men and push them back online. General Washington would lose the battle that day. It was September the 11th, 1777. But he was able to save the army to fight another day. So thus the wound would have the best of me. I was taken from the field by stretcher, then by cart, even by boat for several days. And weeks later, do you know where I found myself? In Bethlehem. Not the Holy Land, madame. I had not died. But Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. I had been nursed back to health by the lovely Moravian girls there. I dare say, were it not for them, I would have lost my leg, perhaps my life. Well, Washington sent me a dispatch saying, oh, Monsieur le Marquis, I am so pleased to hear that you are recovering from your wound, but you have been away from the field for these many weeks. What exactly is keeping you there in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania? I said, Mon Général, you obviously have never met these lovely Moravian girls. But please do not think ill of them, or certainly not of me, for it was their devotion to God to this great cause and to me, that kept me alive, that saved my leg, and enabled me to continue on in this great struggle. For friends, as you know well, there was a dark cloud approaching. General Washington had just given the order to march into what we call winter quarters. Some of you refer to it as the bloody footsteps in the snow, others simply as Valley Forge. Now, let me ask all of you a question. Did all of you, when you decided to declare for independence in July of 1776, wish to be free and independent from England? Oh, some say yes, some say no, some don't respond at all. And according to John Adams, the country was divided into thirds. A third wishing for independence, a third wishing to remain loyal to King George, and a third, well, undecided, wanting to see what was going to happen next. So with 1/3 of the population only, made up of not great warriors just yet, but rather farmers and tradesmen and shopkeepers, they were ready to take up arms and fight against one of the strongest armies on the planet. Why, my friends? Why did they do it? Why did you do it? For many reasons, but because you believed in this great and noble cause. You believed in the Declaration of Independence. You believed in Washington, that he would persevere, that he would overcome, that he would triumph in the end, even at the cost of his own life. It was a cause worth fighting for. It was a cause worth dying for. So thus we marched into that winter encampment at Valley Forge, and in truth, many thought we would never march out again. But good news would soon arrive. First, in the form of a victory at a place called Saratoga. 5,000 of the enemy would be taken prisoner there, a grand victory indeed. Second, with the birth of the new year, many foreign officers like myself would flock to the American banner to lend their expertise. One such man was a Prussian, a German named Baron von Steuben. In fact, I remember seeing you at the winter encampment, monsieur. You remember Baron von Steuben, don't you? He could not speak English very well, but I believe he could use profanity in every other language. And that might have helped you to learn your drill as quickly as possible. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it would be my country of France that would change the nature of this war. For France would be the first nation in the world to recognize the United States of America as its own free and independent nation. And then she declared war upon England. So thus it had gone from a revolt, a rebellion, a civil war of sorts, to a world war, with battles being fought across the globe, in India, Africa, the West Indies, Europe itself, and at the same time right here in North America. A difficult task for any nation, but even more difficult for England. For though she has always had one of the best armies and best navies in all of the world, one thing she lacked was great numbers of soldiers. So she changed her strategy. She thought she would take a small but highly professional army and send it to the southern regions of North America, where she could find that 1/3 of the population that still wished to remain loyal to King George. She could raise up new regiments, provisional regiments, or loyalist regiments like the Queen's Rangers, British Legion, American Legion, and that would help her to put down the rebellion. She also solicited the help of the German states of the Holy Roman Empire, specifically that of Hesse-Kassel, Hesse-Darmstadt, the free cities of Hanau, Frankfurt, and Brandenburg. These Hessians came in numbers as high as 20,000 strong. And unfortunately, her plan worked very well at first. For we all recall reading about the losses at Savannah in 79, the fall of Charleston in May of 1780, the lesser engagements around that city like the Blackstocks, the massacre at the Waxhaws, the debacle at Camden. The list went on and on. We did not think we would find victory, but soon good news arrived. General Washington would dispatch me, the Marquis de Lafayette, to Virginia, and he gave me 3 tasks. First, it was to capture a man we all once called a friend. Do you know of whom I speak? I know many of you are hesitant to even utter his name. Washington would no longer speak his name, simply referring to him as the traitor, but you are correct, madam. Benedict Arnold, a man who once fought so valiantly for this great cause at Quebec in 75, Valcour Island in 76, was perhaps responsible for the twin victories here in Saratoga in September and October of 77. But he betrayed the cause. In exchange for what? English gold, English command? Well, I was to capture him. Second, it tied in with the first. I was to prevent the enemy from capturing all of the vitally needed supplies to be found there in that breadbasket of North America, as Virginia was commonly called. For the Virginians had remained untouched throughout the war since the departure of the last of their royal governors, John Murray IV, Earl of Dunmore. So all of its foodstuffs, military supplies, livestock could all be used for the war effort, whomever could get their hands upon it. I was to stop them. And thirdly, when General Washington gave the order, I was to march my new division up here to New York to assist him in attacking New York City, which he felt was the key to victory in the war. Well, as it turns out, my friends, I was not able to complete any of my tasks. And the war would not take place in New York City. Instead, it would take place in Virginia. I began fighting a cat-and-mouse campaign against our enemy, Lord Cornwallis. Unfortunately, I was the mouse the majority of the times. Battles such as Point of Forks, Spencer's Ordinary, and Green Springs Plantation until, by the 3rd week of August, I received the dispatch that I had longed for. It was from Washington, informing me that he was not going to attack New York City, but instead he would march southwards and join me in Virginia, where we would gain the advantage against our enemy, Lord Cornwallis, who had placed himself in a tiny little hamlet called Yorktown. And he would not be alone, for with him would be the grand French army, commanded by General Jean-Baptiste Donatien-Vimeur, le Comte de Rochambeau, who had arrived in Newport in Rhode Island, July the 10th and the 11th of 1780. So they began their march, but before they even set foot upon Virginia's soil, a great victory had already been achieved. And this one happened to be at sea. The French fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, normally guarding the lucrative sugar islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, had entered into the Chesapeake. To intercept them, an English fleet under Admiral Graves, they fought on the 5th of September, 1781, the Battle of the Capes, and the French were victorious. This was pivotal, my friends, because it meant that our enemy, Lord Cornwallis, who was 12 miles from Williamsburg, no longer could escape by sea or be resupplied by sea. It was simply a question of time. Now, Washington and Rochambeau arrived in the city of Williamsburg on the 14th of September, and each day thereafter, more and more bataillons, regiments, brigades, and divisions would arrive until we amassed 21,000 men. Now, French Admiral de Grasse invited Washington on board his flagship called the Ville de Paris, the most powerful warship in the Western Hemisphere with over 100 cannons. Now, I don't know if any of you had ever met Admiral de Grasse, but he's a very big man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, and please don't tell him I told you this, but nearly as wide in girth. And when he saw Washington, who stands 6 foot 2 inches tall, he threw open his arms and he said to him, "Ah, mon petit général, ah, my little general." Now, we thought this might be construed as an insult, but Washington began to smile and laugh wholeheartedly. I think you could have called him anything at all that day because of the significance of the Battle of the Capes. We began the march on Yorktown on the 28th. We surrounded that place. We pushed our guns in place. We began the bombardment. And by the 19th of October, 1781, we had achieved our victory, the greatest victory in the war. As we know, the war would stretch on for 2 more years, but with the Treaty of Paris, it had come to an end. Do you know, my friends, the last time I would see His Excellency General Washington was 1784. We had spent 2 glorious weeks together at his beloved Mount Vernon, there reflecting upon the war and the future of this nation. We rode on to a place called Annapolis in Maryland, said goodbye to many of the officers we had the honor and privilege to have served with, and then onwards to a place called Marlborough, and that is where I would say my goodbyes. But not before the General said this to me. He said, "Monsieur le Marquis, I sincerely believe that the easy part was winning this war." I could not imagine he would say such a thing after all of the trials and tribulations we had been through, but he explained himself further by saying, "I do believe that the much more difficult part will be for these 13 former colonies that have now formed 13 United States, well, getting along with one another." Well, my friends, look at how far you have gone. From 13 to 24 United States, you have endured war, civil strife, turmoil, yet you have endured. And why is that? Well, I dare say it is because of the foundation that was built at the price of so much sacrifice and blood by you, the American patriot. In fact, I will go further. I will say that one day this nation shall serve as a beacon for all other nations, as the truest example of freedom and of independence. God bless you all, my dear friends, and God bless this great nation of the United States of America. I thank you. I thank you, my friends. I thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon to listen to my story as I am preparing to head towards the federal city of Washington for a birthday party that your newly elected president, John Quincy Adams, is going to give me at the Maison Blanche, at the White House. And then I shall depart on board a newly christened American warship called the Brandywine, which I think is fitting, and there I shall return back to France. But you know, my friends, there is one person who I've been traveling with who always insists on being introduced. You won't find him very interesting at all, but he always insists that I introduce him to everyone. He's just sulking around the corner there. May I go fetch him? Pardon me for just a moment. Oh, is he back there? Oh, there he is. Gentlemen and ladies, my name is Mark Schneider, and I portray the Marquis de Lafayette. Thank you, friends. And thank you, ABC and Paul and everyone who's involved here for allowing me to come and speak with you this afternoon and come to this beautiful place. So for me, I am not as interesting as the Marquis de Lafayette, but I have had the honor and privilege of portraying this amazing person of history for the last 28 years at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I think the name Lafayette everybody has heard of. Whatever state you're from, you have a Lafayette this or a Lafayette that, a county, a town, maybe a street, whatever, or all of the above. But sometimes the details of his life are not so evident. And this affords us an opportunity to tell the story of this remarkable man who came at his own expense, risked his life, risked his reputation to come help America win its independence. And I think the name Lafayette is synonymous with the Franco-American relationship. After all, when General Blackjack Pershing came to France to assist the French now in their moment of peril, he said, "Lafayette, we are here." And we even see it echoed again with speeches made by President Macron, using the names like Lafayette and Washington and Rochambeau and de Grasse, all of these great people of the past. And I am a firm believer that all of the answers to the future can be found in the past if we study our history. And that's why I believe it is so important to remember somebody like Lafayette and the sacrifices that were made. So an organization that I'm also a part of is called the American Friends of Lafayette. And this organization formed in 1932. And it celebrates all things Lafayette. There's a journal, we have conferences, but what we've done for the last year is recreate the return of the Marquis de Lafayette to America. Now, President Monroe had met Lafayette, oddly enough, at the Battle of Brandywine. When Lafayette was wounded in the left leg, the surgeon who was working on patching his leg told young Lieutenant Monroe to distract him. So he began describing the beauty of Virginia. Now, there's no denying the beauty of Virginia, but at that moment, I don't think Lafayette cared. But regardless, thus began this wonderful relationship betwixt the two of them. Monroe would serve during the war, but eventually go back to Virginia, and they would meet for the last time in 1784. But then Monroe will be dispatched to France to serve as a minister. Lafayette gets taken up in the craziness of the French Revolution and is actually imprisoned by the Austrians for 5 years, from 1792 to 1797. And his wife and 2 daughters were arrested as well, and they were going to be sent to the guillotine. Monroe is sent to France in July of 1794. And he tells the French Republic, who loves him, they gave him a standing ovation in the National Assembly, their legislative body. He said, "We have declared neutrality, but if any harm comes to the Marquis de Lafayette or his family, we could always change our minds." And it was actually his remarkable wife, Elizabeth Monroe, who kept visiting Adrienne, Lafayette's wife, and it helped to get them released. Eventually, he'll come back to America, but be dispatched by Jefferson in 1803 to become another minister and take part in the Louisiana Purchase, and Lafayette will not see him again until 1824. So in February of 1824, Monroe sends a message to Lafayette saying, "I will send an American ship to any port of your choosing so you might come back to America as a guest of the nation." So we have begun to recreate this amazing journey. A year ago this week, we were in New York City. We landed on the southern tip of Manhattan, and then we have covered the entirety of the tour to include great visits to Boston and to Providence, Philadelphia, Baltimore, the Federal City. We were able to address Congress. We went to New Orleans and Charleston and up the Mississippi River into all those little towns and hamlets that Lafayette had passed through. And the various committees were so excited to be able to celebrate their history and their connection with America's favorite fighting Frenchman, Lafayette. Yes. But that being said, I think now is a wonderful opportunity for us to switch over to some questions and curiosities that you might have of the Marquis or some of the subjects that I spoke of here this afternoon. So we shall open the floor to all of you.
Okay. To start out with a rather mundane question, how did you, as the Marquis and General Washington, communicate between your two languages?
A great question. So how did Washington, who never spoke French, communicate with the Marquis de Lafayette? Now, Lafayette, in his journals, speaks about he had his best English lessons in between bouts of seasickness on board the ship La Victoire when he first came to America. So let's look at his timeline briefly. He lands in South Carolina on the 13th of June, 1777. The vast majority of Americans did not speak French. He also immersed himself with trying to learn English as quickly as possible, knowing the simple fact that Washington and Congress are not going to give him command of anything at all if he does not speak the language of command, which is English. He meets Washington there on the 5th day of August. Washington, once again, I emphasize, did not speak French, so he was speaking. The telltale sign is during the Battle of Brandywine, when he sends him in to try to rally the troops of General Sullivan's division. So if he was yelling at them in French, they might still be running to this day. So by that time, Washington had the confidence in him that he could speak the language of command, which is English. That's not a mundane question. That's a great question.
A little of the l'histoire. You said that you were imprisoned 1792 to 96, I think you said?
92 to 97, yes.
97, yeah, okay, in Austria. But the really bad part of the French Revolution was more in the beginning. I'm thinking more around 1789. How did you survive those years? What was your tactic? Because the royals were being attacked. Everybody was being attacked. Robespierre had no, I don't know, morals, I don't know, but how did you do that?
So another great question, Lafayette's role during the French Revolution. How did he survive, most notably the Reign of Terror? So the early part of the French Revolution is actually the best part for Lafayette. So he is a friend of the people. He fought in a revolution here in America. He's a member of the Second Estate, the aristocracy. He's a friend of the king at that moment. And then he also will be made commander of a military organization called the Garde Nationale de Paris. It's a military force to keep order in a very volatile city of about 650,000 people in 1789. He also writes a document with the assistance of the ambassador from America to France, Thomas Jefferson, and that document is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This serves as a preamble to all French constitutions that will come, and it speaks about natural rights that all people, regardless of what nation they come from, should be able to enjoy, some of them being life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, freedom from oppression. If they sound somewhat familiar, remember, right next to him is Thomas Jefferson crossing his T's and dotting his I's. So that is the high point of Lafayette's life. The revolution then begins to spin out of control. What they were looking for was a constitutional monarchy. The difference between a constitutional monarchy and an absolute monarchy is you preserve the king as your chief executive, not unlike your president, but you create a legislative body of elected representatives of the people, so there can be checks and balances. This is achieved by October the 6th, 1789. In France, they thought they had their glorious revolution, like the English had in the latter part of the 17th century with the restoration of Charles II. But it began to spill out of control. Many people, the 24 million Frenchmen living at that time, were in want of a republic. Now, a republic's not a bad thing. You have a republic. You've done very well with your republic, but it was the way in which that republic was created. For the King and Queen of France were then arrested for crimes against the state, and they were sent to a new device called the Louisette, which you know much better as the guillotine. And so when you execute what is arguably the most powerful monarchs in all of the world, it makes the rest of the monarchs of the world nervous. So that's why they all began to invade France. And that is why Lafayette grew unpopular. So him fleeing from France with his staff and being arrested by the Austrians undoubtedly saved his life, because Robespierre, Danton, Saint-Just, Marat, all of them disliked Lafayette and wanted him to be sent to the guillotine. So the imprisonment was very difficult. It was 5 years long, but at least he saved his head.
Monsieur Lafayette, I am greatly appreciative of all that you did for our nation during the French Revolution and all that you suffered. I found this picture somewhere, and I keep this by my fireplace to honor you at my home.
Madam, that is such a great honor. This is me when I was in the uniform of the Garde Nationale de Paris, going over some plans of the Vauban-style fortresses there about the year 1789. So, Madam, you honor me so by keeping this by your bedside.
Thank you.
Kind of a follow-up to one of the earlier questions. I want to know, when you went back to France, you were there during the whole Napoleonic era. How did you get along with Napoleon? Because obviously the two of you don't think alike.
A superb question. How did I get along with Napoleon? It's interesting because I also portray Napoleon, so sometimes I have a love-hate relationship with myself. But Napoleon and Lafayette did not get along. So it is actually Napoleon in his first Italian campaign of 1796 and 97, in which he's defeating the Austrians left and right, and as he's marching towards Vienna, he stops by a place called Campo Formio, and there a treaty is made called the Treaty of Campo Formio. It is that treaty that gets Lafayette released from his imprisonment at a place called Olmütz, which is in Moravia, which is the Czech Republic today. So Napoleon gets Lafayette out of jail. The issue for Lafayette is that he could not immediately go back to France unless he swore allegiance to the new government. The government that toppled Robespierre with what we call the Thermidorian reaction is called the Directoire, and the Directoire is headed by a man named Paul Barras. And so Lafayette would have had to have sworn allegiance to him, and he said no way. So he lived in the Netherlands until Napoleon performs a coup d'etat in November of 1799, and he becomes master of France. Now, Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, meets with Napoleon's wife, Josephine, and they say, our husbands should get along. I would have loved to have been present for that conversation. And they both agreed, but the problem is that Lafayette was an ardent constitutional monarchist, and Bonaparte was in favor of, well, Bonaparte. So it never came to pass. The king's younger brother, Louis XVIII, who would succeed him, actually wrote a letter to Napoleon saying, thank you for restoring order out of the chaos of the revolution, but I'll take the helm now. And Napoleon didn't respond to his letter. So throughout the Napoleonic Wars, he retires to private life. He does not serve Napoleon in any capacity, even though Napoleon had offered him to serve as a senator, as a general, as ambassador to America. But if you're an ambassador, you have to endorse your head of state and what they're asking you to do. And Lafayette just could not do that. So I think we know that they met periodically throughout the Napoleonic Wars because I think Lafayette was very truthful to Napoleon. Now, the worst part about it is that Napoleon will be exiled in April of 1814, but he escapes from exile on the island of Elba, and he comes back for what we call the 100 Days that ends at the Battle of Waterloo. Well, there was a restoration, briefly, of Louis XVIII, and Lafayette was once again made commander of the National Guard, a sizable military force, and Napoleon was in need of sizable military forces. So he went to Lafayette and requested that he swear allegiance to him, and Lafayette said no. And so Napoleon called Lafayette the greatest traitor in France. But he was just upset. Then he would fall at Waterloo, and that would be the end. So they did not get along at all. But here's one little end note. When Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, which is a tiny island equidistant between Africa and South America, where he eventually would die, they found out the conditions for him were horrible. And in French newspapers, because they were a royalist newspaper, they would not print the conditions that he was living in. So Lafayette, even though Napoleon called him the greatest traitor in France, contacted his American friends and asked if they would put this in American newspapers, because he was always fighting for human rights. Even a guy who insulted him politically, he was still trying to do something for Napoleon. So I think that really speaks volumes as to the character of the Marquis de Lafayette. But Napoleon would die on May 5th, 1821, but he did make that attempt. Yes, sir.
My question is, during the Washington, I think it was between his first and second administration when France and Britain had their war, there were two parties that were trying to get basically George Washington to support either Britain or France. What was Lafayette's, what was his opinion, and how, because George Washington wanted to stay neutral, which was a great thing during that time because we were a small country. But what was Lafayette like? Did he advise the president at all during that time? Or,
So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, either for England or for France, Lafayette is imprisoned during this time from 1792 to 97 when all of Europe begins to declare war upon France. So the decision for the President of the United States to declare neutrality was the best decision he could have made. It was the most responsible decision he could have made. America had barely won her revolution. She didn't have any money, she didn't have much of an army, she didn't have much of a navy, and if he allied himself with France, he would now be at war with all of Europe. That is not good for the American people, and that's the responsibility of the President of the United States and Congress, is to look after the best interests of the citizens. So he declared neutrality, and it was a logical decision. Now, even though America did not send troops, she did send food. And of the 24 million Frenchmen, there were many, many bad harvests. There was a drought, and people were not just seeing to their crops. So thus, the staple of the French diet is bread. If you don't have grain, you don't have bread. And tons of grain were dispatched from the Chesapeake Bay region to feed and save the lives of perhaps hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen. So America did help, but it was the most logical decision to declare neutrality. So Lafayette never had any issue with that decision that was made by the president.
When you were 19 and all these people didn't want you to come support America, and your wife was just newly pregnant, what did you say when you wanted to go and fight this war, and how did you manage to stay married in the midst of
those are all logical
this?
questions, yes. So,
Good questions.
So Lafayette is married when he's 16, and his wife is 14. Initially, they were going to get married at 14 and 12, but they felt that was too young. So it was an arranged marriage between two families. They were two of the most well-known families, Lafayette and de Noailles, also wealthiest families, and it would turn out to be a marriage of love. The first child they have, she has when she's 17, and tragically that child dies when he's in America for the first time in 77. So Adrienne knew that Lafayette wanted to come to America to take part in this revolution, but he did not exactly tell her when he was going and for how long he was going, and he was gone for 2 years. But no doubt all of you ladies would be equally supportive of your husbands if they disappeared for 2 years. Including at Brandywine, when he's wounded, report comes back to Versailles that he's dead. So there was a time where she thought her husband was dead. And then she got another letter, oh no, he's not. So she's an amazing woman. If you ever get an opportunity to read any biographies about Adrienne, she is remarkable, because Lafayette, the idealist, is always going off on these adventures, lending money, his voice, his right arm, his pen, and his purse for these great causes, which is wonderful. But back at home, you have Adrienne looking after the children, looking after him. And when she is released by Elizabeth Monroe and James Monroe, she goes directly to Olmutz and voluntarily joins Lafayette in prison. The son had been dispatched to America to grow up with his namesake. His son's name was George Washington, and he grew up at Mount Vernon. And the two daughters, Anastasia and Virginia, they go with Adrienne and join Lafayette in prison. The tragedy of all of that is that she contracts the sickness that ultimately will kill her. So the conditions at Olmütz were horrible. They get released in 1797. She lives another decade until 1807, but she progressively gets worse and worse and worse and dies in 1807. So when she dies, she's buried in a cemetery called Picpus Cemetery. The reason being is because much of her family suffered horribly during the French Revolution, and they were put in a mass grave there. So, of course, she wanted to be close. And when Lafayette dies, of course, he's buried right next to her. The interesting thing about Lafayette's burial is that he's buried in France, but atop his casket was soil that he brought back from the ceremony at Bunker Hill. So he's buried in American soil, and perpetually an American and French flag will fly over his grave. And they have a ceremony every 4th of July there at Picpus.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you again. Bon voyage, have a good season, and thank you, Marquis de Lafayette.
Thank you very much. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. You did a great job as the king. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Is that okay?
Excellent.
Okay.
Outstanding.
Sarasota have a wonderful
Yes.
on your cruises.
Yes, thank you very much.